Lindsay Musgrove was, by all accounts, a compassionate, caring individual. A bright student, she graduated with a degree in biology from Quinnipiac University in 2012, and 2 years later, she obtained her nursing license. Her journey led her to Massachusetts General Hospital, where she studied at the Institute of Health Professions. Lindsay's dedication to helping others found its place as a labor and delivery nurse at the hospital, where she quickly gained a reputation for being a consummate caregiver. Her colleagues adored working with her, drawn to her attention to detail, her remarkable empathy, and the genuine connection she formed with the families she cared for. Lindsay's calm presence and unwavering patience made her the preferred nurse for many, especially when it came to guiding nervous parents through the intense experience of childbirth. In 2016, Lindsay married Patrick Clancy, a talented computer software engineer. The couple's life seemed idyllic, filled with promise. Just a year later, they welcomed their first daughter, Cora, a sweet, nurturing older sister with big dreams of becoming a doctor and a mother herself. Then came Dawson in 2019, a lively and charismatic boy whose infectious smile and laughter could brighten any room. And by 2022, the couple was blessed with a third child, Kaylin, a happy, easygoing baby who was often called Happy Kaylin by his doting parents. The Clancy family's life appeared picture-perfect. They lived in a beautiful, sprawling home in Duxbury, Massachusetts, purchased for $500,000. With a white picket fence and a playground in the backyard, their home seemed like the embodiment of the American dream. It was a place filled with love, laughter, and the promise of a bright future. To friends and family, Lindsay and Patrick seemed to have it all: a beautiful home, 3 wonderful children, and a marriage that many would envy. The couple rarely fought, and their deep affection for each other was evident in the simple but powerful exchanges of "I love you" throughout each day. Their bond was undeniable, a symbol of unwavering love and support. Patrick was a devoted father, always in the backyard, laughing and playing with his children. For Lindsay, there was nothing more important than her kids. She reveled in motherhood, believing it to be the most rewarding and fulfilling role she could ever have. Her social media was filled with images of her children, always accompanied by heartfelt posts like, "I feel like the luckiest mama in the world," and "so unbelievably thankful for this family and life." Those who knew her described Lindsay as the kind of mother who would leave parties early just to be with her babies, and she hated hearing them cry, even when sleep training them. She poured herself into her children, determined to give them the very best. If you were shocked by this unimaginable turn of events, make sure to hit that subscribe button to stay updated on more chilling true crime stories like this. Like this video if you want to hear more about cases that defy belief, and drop a comment below with your thoughts. What do you think drove her to do the unthinkable? We'd love to hear your take on this tragic story. But underneath the surface, things weren't always as perfect as they seemed. As time passed, Lindsay began to feel the weight of motherhood bearing down on her. The emotional toll of raising 3 young children became overwhelming, and she struggled to balance the challenges of her personal life with the demands of motherhood. Yet, despite her internal battles, she presented a picture of a woman in control, sharing on Facebook how much smoother her experience with Kaylin was going compared to her earlier struggles with her other children. She attributed her progress to focusing on exercise, nutrition, and taking the time to rest. However, as the months wore on, Lindsay's anxiety began to mount. She started to dread returning to work after her maternity leave, the pressure of juggling a full-time career with the needs of her growing family pushing her to the brink. The perfect life she had once seemed to lead began to fray at the edges. And soon, what appeared to be a picture-perfect family would unravel in a shocking and unimaginable way. As Lindsay's anxiety deepened, the weight of her responsibilities became unbearable. She sought relief through therapy, trying various treatments and medications in an effort to cope. But by September 2022, her anxiety reached a breaking point. Desperate for answers, she turned to a new course of treatment, seeking an evaluation at the Women and Infant Center for Women's Behavioral Health in Providence. Despite her efforts, the diagnosis didn't match the severity of her feelings. She was not diagnosed with postpartum depression, which left her with an unsettling sense of uncertainty. On January 1, 2023, Lindsay made a heart-wrenching confession to her husband, Patrick. She admitted that she had thoughts of harming herself and her children. Those words, uttered in the quiet of their home, struck terror in Patrick's heart. He immediately supported Lindsay's decision to seek help, and she was admitted to Milan Hospital for mental health treatment. For 5 days, she received care, and when she was discharged, the doctors assured Patrick that Lindsay no longer posed a danger to herself or others. But something didn't feel right. Throughout January, Lindsay seemed to improve. Her family went on outings, visiting museums and enjoying dinners together. Lindsay herself spoke of her newfound optimism. Even her tone in texts to her mother was noticeably lighter. It seemed as though she was healing, or at least, pretending to. But deep inside, Lindsay was battling something far darker, something she hadn't shared with anyone. By January 24, 2023, those inner demons would finally manifest in the most unimaginable way. It began like any other day. Lindsay took her children to the doctor for a routine checkup. Her daughter, Cora, had an appointment with her pediatrician, and the family returned home afterwards, enjoying a fun afternoon in the snow. Lindsay snapped pictures of her children playing in the winter wonderland, sharing them with Patrick and her mother, showcasing a picture-perfect family life. But the truth beneath that seemingly normal scene was far from serene. At 4 p.m. after the children had come inside and warmed up, Lindsay began searching online. She Googled "kids Miralax" and then checked the CVS website, calling a store in Kingston to inquire about the availability of children's Miralax. She also used Apple Maps to figure out how long it would take to drive to the nearby 3V restaurant. She texted Patrick, working from home in the basement, "Any chance you want to do takeout from 3V? I didn't cook anything. It's been a long day." The message seemed casual, nothing out of the ordinary. But when Patrick replied, agreeing to check the menu, Lindsay's behavior seemed strange. She chose a Mediterranean power bowl for herself, while Patrick picked out a scallop and pork belly risotto. At 5:10 p.m. Lindsay called 3V to place the order, mentioning that Patrick would pick it up. Patrick then left the house around 5:15 p.m. stopping by CVS to pick up the children's medications. At 5:32 p.m. Patrick arrived at CVS, but when he tried to reach Lindsay by phone, there was no answer. 1 minute later, at 5:34 p.m. Lindsay returned his call, and they spoke for a brief 14 minutes. The conversation, though seemingly normal, felt off to Patrick. There was something strange about her tone, though he couldn't pinpoint it. By 6 p.m. Patrick arrived home, dinner and medications in hand. But as he pulled into the driveway, a heavy silence hung in the air. The house, normally filled with the sounds of his children's laughter and Lindsay's voice, was eerily quiet. His stomach churned as he stepped inside, his heart pounding in his chest. He called out for Lindsay and the kids, but there was no response. Panic set in as he searched room by room, calling their names. There was no sign of them. His anxiety grew with every passing second, his mind racing. Where were they? Were they okay? He grabbed his phone and dialed Lindsay's number. It rang through to voicemail. A knot tightened in his stomach. This wasn't right. With growing dread, he ascended the stairs to their master bedroom. The silence in the house was suffocating, each step he took echoing louder than the last. When he reached the door, he noticed it was locked, a detail that immediately struck him as strange. Lindsay had never locked herself in the bedroom before. Heart racing, Patrick turned the knob, desperate to find out what was happening behind that door. On the floor of the basement, their small bodies eerily still. The exercise bands, a seemingly innocuous object, had become grim instruments of tragedy, twisted tightly around their necks. Patrick's mind reeled, unable to process the scene before him. His children, his precious children, were lying there, lifeless, as his world crumbled around him. His heart raced with terror as he knelt beside them, trying desperately to rouse them. He shook Cora gently, whispering her name over and over, his voice breaking with every syllable. No response. He turned to Dawson, his older son, pleading with him to wake up. Still nothing. And then, to Kellen, his youngest, only a few years old, who lay motionless on the cold concrete floor. Please, God, no, Patrick choked out, feeling the weight of helplessness crush him. His hands trembled as he checked for signs of life. There was a faint pulse in Cora's wrist, but it was weak and uneven. The others showed no signs of breathing. Frantic, Patrick screamed into the phone, "They're not breathing. They're not breathing." The dispatcher, equally horrified, urged him to perform CPR, but Patrick had no idea how to properly administer it to children so small. He felt utterly useless, his mind paralyzed by the overwhelming fear and the cruel reality of what was happening. As the minutes stretched on, it felt like an eternity before the first officers arrived at the scene. They rushed down into the basement, immediately assessing the situation. Patrick, his voice hoarse with emotion, stepped aside as the officers moved in with precise, practiced efficiency. They quickly began administering life-saving techniques on the children, checking their airways, and performing CPR. Patrick stood back, watching helplessly, praying that it wasn't too late. His mind flickered back to the moment when he had found Lindsay in the backyard, barely conscious. Had she planned this all along? Had the dark thoughts that had plagued her for months finally taken their toll? The piece of the puzzle seemed to fit together too well. Lindsay, in her fragile state, had seemingly snapped, leaving her family to pay the price. But as Patrick watched the officers work feverishly on his children, a flicker of hope surged within him. They weren't giving up. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance. Paramedics arrived minutes later, and the air became thick with urgency. They rushed to the basement to assist the officers, continuing the life-saving measures. Patrick watched as they performed chest compressions on Cora, Dawson, and Kellen, their movements quick and methodical. He held his breath, barely able to comprehend what was unfolding. His children were fighting for their lives, and so was Lindsay, who lay outside, unconscious and fighting her own demons. In the chaos of the moment, Patrick's phone buzzed with a message from his mother-in-law. It was a simple text, "How's Lindsay?" Patrick's eyes blurred with tears. He couldn't answer. He couldn't find the words to explain what had just happened, what was still happening. Minutes felt like hours as the paramedics worked tirelessly. Patrick's heart pounded in his chest as he clung to the smallest sliver of hope. Would they make it? Would his children survive? Would Lindsay? If you were shocked by this unimaginable turn of events, make sure to hit that subscribe button to stay updated on more chilling true crime stories like this. Like this video if you want to hear more about cases that defy belief, and drop a comment below with your thoughts. What do you think drove her to do the unthinkable? We'd love to hear your take on this tragic story. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Cora's small body gave a shudder, a weak gasp of air filling her lungs. The paramedics jumped into action, performing further resuscitation efforts. Dawson, too, began to show signs of life, a faint breath escaping his lips. Kellen, though, remained unresponsive, his small chest unmoving. The room was filled with a tense stillness as the paramedics continued their work, desperate to revive the youngest of the three. Patrick could hardly bear to look, but he couldn't tear his eyes away. This was his family, his world, teetering on the edge of an abyss. He thought about how everything had been normal just hours ago, dinner plans, an afternoon in the snow, the quiet, mundane moments of family life. And now, his wife had nearly destroyed everything. Lindsay, still lying in the backyard, was slowly being stabilized by another team of paramedics. They had managed to stop the bleeding, and though she was still in critical condition, there was hope. The darkness that had overtaken her mind was now mirrored in the devastation she had wrought. As the paramedics continued to work, Patrick felt numb, overwhelmed by the weight of the situation. His children were alive, but barely. Lindsay was still fighting for her life. And in the midst of it all, the questions swirled in his mind like a vortex he couldn't escape. How had they ended up here? What could have been done to prevent this? The sound of sirens grew louder as more ambulances arrived, bringing more medical personnel. The paramedics had managed to stabilize the children, but they needed to get them to the hospital as quickly as possible. Patrick watched as Cora, Dawson, and Kellen were loaded onto stretchers, their small forms covered in blankets, their lives hanging in the balance. Patrick's legs felt like they might give way as he followed the ambulance, his mind numb. He couldn't process what had just happened. All he could think about was his children and his wife, how much they had been through, how fragile they all were, and how none of this made any sense. As he sat in the back of the ambulance, staring at the faint rise and fall of his children's chests, the weight of the moment crashed down on him. This was his new reality, a nightmare he had never imagined. His wife, the woman he had built a life with, had nearly destroyed everything, and now he was left to pick up the pieces. The journey to the hospital felt like a blur. The flashing lights outside, the hum of the ambulance, the sound of his own heartbeat thundering in his ears, everything faded into the background as Patrick's mind replayed the events, the horrifying realization that nothing would ever be the same again. When they arrived at the hospital, the medical team immediately took over, rushing the children into emergency care. Patrick was left standing in the hallway, his body frozen with fear, his mind reeling. He tried to hold it together, but the overwhelming grief and confusion threatened to overtake him at any moment. A nurse approached him, her face serious but compassionate. "We're doing everything we can," she reassured him. But even her words seemed distant, hollow. Patrick nodded numbly, unable to speak. As he sat in the sterile waiting room, his thoughts turned to Lindsay. What had driven her to this point? How had she fallen so far into despair? And what would happen next? The hours passed slowly, each one dragging as Patrick awaited news about his children. His mind was consumed with questions and worries, but there was one thing he knew for certain: nothing would ever be the same again. His family, once whole, was now fractured in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. The killings. The prosecutor argued that Lindsay's actions were calculated and deliberate, as evidenced by the way she had carefully wrapped the exercise bands around her children's necks, ensuring their suffocation. They painted a portrait of a woman who, despite her struggles with mental health, had shown a clear intent to harm her family. The case against Lindsay Clancy grew increasingly complex as the details of her mental health treatment came to light. While her attorneys sought to focus on the potential effects of her medications and the possibility of postpartum depression or psychosis, the prosecution insisted that her actions were not just a result of mental illness, but a conscious decision driven by something darker. The contrast between the two sides only deepened the public's fascination with the case, as many began to debate whether Lindsay's actions were the tragic result of untreated mental health issues, or whether they were rooted in something far more sinister. As Lindsay's defense attorneys fought for her to be evaluated by a forensic psychiatrist, they argued that her struggle with mental health had been poorly managed and exacerbated by overmedication. They claimed that, in her fragile mental state, Lindsay may not have been fully aware of the severity of her actions when she took the lives of her children. The drugs she had been prescribed, some of which were known to have severe side effects, including suicidal and homicidal tendencies, were part of a cocktail that Lindsay had been prescribed by multiple doctors, despite the risks associated with their combined use. Patrick, in the wake of the tragedy, remained largely silent in the media, his grief overwhelming. But on the GoFundMe page, he expressed an outpouring of love and forgiveness for his wife, even as he struggled to reconcile the woman he had known with the person who had committed such an unthinkable act. He wrote that, despite everything, Lindsay was still the mother of his children, and that his love for her had not disappeared, despite the horrific events. His words were filled with a painful contradiction: love for the woman who had taken so much from him, and heartbreak over the loss of the children he could never bring back. In the weeks following the tragedy, Patrick's grief became the focal point of media coverage. The public's sympathy was divided. Some viewed him as a grieving father trying to make sense of an unimaginable loss, while others criticized his response to the tragedy, wondering if his forgiveness was too easy or misplaced. The case became a national story, with people from all walks of life debating the nature of Lindsay's actions, the responsibility of medical professionals who had prescribed her medications, and the role of mental illness in acts of violence. Lindsay's trial, which began months after the tragedy, was heavily publicized, with the courtrooms filling with spectators and media outlets clamoring for every detail. The question on everyone's mind was whether Lindsay's mental health could be used as a defense to mitigate the charges against her. Her defense team argued that the medications she had been prescribed, along with the postpartum depression she had suffered from after the birth of her third child, had clouded her judgment and led to the unthinkable actions she had taken. But the prosecution maintained that Lindsay's actions were not simply the result of mental illness. They pointed to her apparent lack of remorse and the careful manner in which she had planned the murders, showing no signs of the emotional volatility typically associated with those who commit crimes of passion. The prosecution called her behavior a manifestation of extreme cruelty and atrocity. As the trial wore on, Patrick's anguish was palpable. The toll it took on him was evident in his every appearance, his face a mixture of disbelief and pain. He sat through each day of the proceedings, his eyes red from crying, his hands often trembling as he tried to understand the woman who had once been his partner, the mother of his children. The man who had been so quick to offer forgiveness now found himself torn between the desire for justice and the complex reality of the woman he had loved. In the final days of the trial, the defense team called upon expert witnesses to testify about Lindsay's mental health. A forensic psychiatrist took the stand, speaking at length about Lindsay's struggle with depression, anxiety, and psychosis. He explained how the combination of her medications, some of which were known to cause severe mood swings, suicidal thoughts, and erratic behavior, could have contributed to her actions. He painted a picture of a woman overwhelmed by a perfect storm of mental illness, medications, and untreated psychological trauma. The prosecution countered by calling a series of experts who suggested that Lindsay's actions could not be chalked up solely to mental illness. They emphasized the planning involved in her actions and the deliberate manner in which she had carried out the murders, arguing that she had shown sufficient awareness of the consequences of her actions to be held fully accountable. In the end, the jury deliberated for several days before reaching a verdict. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as the families of the victims and the defendant waited for the decision that would shape the course of Lindsay Clancy's life, and the lives of everyone involved. When the verdict was read, it was a moment that would forever alter the lives of those affected by the tragedy. Lindsay was found guilty of all charges, including the murder of her 3 children. The jury found that her actions, while influenced by mental illness and the overmedication she had suffered from, were not excusable under the law. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Patrick, sitting in the courtroom, felt a mixture of emotions. There was no sense of victory in the verdict, only a sense of finality. The love he had once felt for his wife had been shattered beyond repair, but the weight of the loss he felt for his children was something he knew he would never escape. There would be no justice for the innocent lives taken, no way to undo the pain that had been inflicted on him and his family. After the trial, Patrick retreated from the public eye, his grief continuing to consume him in ways that words could not capture. The GoFundMe campaign, which had raised millions of dollars to cover funeral expenses and other costs, was closed, and the public's focus shifted to the aftermath of the trial. But for Patrick, the story would never be over. His life would forever be defined by the tragedy that had ripped through his family, leaving him to pick up the pieces of a shattered world, haunted by the memories of the children he had loved and lost. Of other mental health issues. In severe cases, these symptoms could progress into postpartum depression, PPD, or even postpartum psychosis, a rare and much more severe condition that can lead to hallucinations, delusions, and violent thoughts. The defense's argument was that Lindsay, under the influence of postpartum psychosis, had lost touch with reality and, in her fragile mental state, believed she was acting to protect her children from some perceived harm, even though such a perception was entirely distorted by her illness. However, while the defense painted a picture of a woman who had been a victim of her own mental illness, the prosecution painted Lindsay in a much darker light. They argued that the act of strangling her children with exercise bands, a deliberate and methodical method of killing, showed a level of planning and awareness that seemed inconsistent with someone suffering from acute postpartum psychosis. The prosecution emphasized the gruesome details, noting how Lindsay appeared to have taken specific steps to ensure her children's deaths, actions that suggested a level of control rather than the uncontrollable impulses typically associated with psychosis. The discussion surrounding the potential connection between postpartum depression, psychosis, and homicidal behavior became a key element of the trial. Legal experts and psychiatrists debated whether Lindsay's mental state at the time of the killings could serve as a mitigating factor or whether it was an attempt to explain away the horror of what she had done. Many in the medical community expressed concern over the overprescription of psychiatric medications, like the numerous drugs Lindsay had been prescribed in the months leading up to the killings, suggesting that these medications may have contributed to a dangerous cocktail of effects that exacerbated her mental health condition and possibly drove her to commit such a heinous act. Lindsay's defense team called several psychiatric experts to testify that Lindsay had been severely overmedicated in the months following the birth of her third child. They argued that a combination of antidepressants, mood stabilizers, and anti-anxiety medications, along with the physical and emotional toll of caring for a newborn while suffering from postpartum depression, had pushed her into a state where she was not fully in control of her actions. These experts highlighted the side effects of the medications, such as suicidal and homicidal tendencies, which had been known to occur in some individuals who were prescribed these drugs. They claimed that, in Lindsay's case, the overmedication likely played a significant role in her mental state, which ultimately led to the deaths of her children. If you were shocked by this unimaginable turn of events, make sure to hit that subscribe button to stay updated on more chilling true crime stories like this. Like this video if you want to hear more about cases that defy belief, and drop a comment below with your thoughts. What do you think drove her to do the unthinkable? We'd love to hear your take on this tragic story. But the prosecution maintained that Lindsay's actions went far beyond what could be explained by mental illness or the side effects of medications. They argued that Lindsay had been aware of her actions when she took her children's lives, that her behavior suggested premeditation, and that the brutal nature of the killings indicated a calculated and deliberate attempt to end their lives. They also pointed to the fact that Lindsay had a history of mental health struggles but had been receiving treatment for those issues and had not been under the influence of any specific crisis at the time of the murders. As the trial continued, it became clear that the central question would not be about Lindsay's guilt or innocence but about how much responsibility she should bear for her actions. Could she truly be held accountable for the deaths of her children if she was under the influence of a mental illness or the effects of overmedication? Or was she simply a mother who had snapped under the immense pressures of her personal struggles, with her mind clouded by both the hormonal changes of childbirth and the toxic mix of medications she had been prescribed? The testimony of experts and the emotional weight of the trial weighed heavily on everyone involved. Lindsay, despite being physically present in the courtroom through a monitor, appeared detached, her face often blank as she watched the horrific details of her actions being laid out before the court. It was a stark contrast to the person Patrick Clancy had once known, a loving wife and mother who had once been a vibrant part of their family. But now, as the trial progressed, it seemed as though the woman who had once been a source of warmth and joy in Patrick's life had been replaced by someone unrecognizable, a woman whose actions had torn their world apart. Patrick, meanwhile, was struggling to reconcile the woman he had loved with the person who had committed such a brutal act. The emotional toll on him was evident. Despite his public statements of forgiveness, the pain of losing his children in such a senseless and violent manner weighed heavily on him. He was left to pick up the pieces of a shattered life, attempting to find some semblance of meaning in the tragedy that had destroyed his family. Public reactions to the case were mixed. Some sympathized with Lindsay, believing that she was a victim of a broken mental health system that had failed to properly address her condition and had inadvertently caused her to commit an unthinkable act. Others, however, were horrified by the brutality of the killings and felt that Lindsay's defense was simply an attempt to evade full responsibility for her actions. The GoFundMe campaign, which had initially been created to help with funeral costs, became a point of contention as some saw it as a way for Lindsay's defense to gain financial support, while others felt it was an opportunity to show compassion for a father who had lost everything. As the trial neared its conclusion, Lindsay's fate was left in the hands of the jury. They were tasked with deciding whether she was criminally responsible for the deaths of her children or whether her mental illness, exacerbated by postpartum depression and the overmedication she had suffered from, should serve as a mitigating factor in her sentencing. The case had become a tragic and complex saga of mental health, loss, and family, raising uncomfortable questions about the role of psychiatric care, medication, and the profound effects of postpartum depression. In the end, the jury's decision would not provide closure or healing for those involved. The pain of losing a child, of losing a family, is a wound that can never truly heal. For Patrick Clancy, the journey toward recovery was just beginning, and he would be forced to live with the unbearable weight of his loss, haunted by the memories of the children who would never grow up, and the woman who had been both his partner and his undoing. The trial ended with Lindsay Clancy being convicted, and the story of her crimes and her tragic mental health struggles remained a deeply painful chapter in the lives of those affected. The questions that had been raised, about the role of mental illness, the responsibility of doctors, and the depths of human suffering, would continue to resonate long after the courtroom lights had faded. From the waist down as a result of an apparent suicide attempt made shortly after the killings. While the defense team maintained that her actions were the result of untreated mental illness, the severity of her injuries has also raised questions about the role of her state of mind at the time of the crime. Patrick, meanwhile, has continued to show immense courage in the face of his unimaginable grief. Despite the harrowing circumstances of losing his 3 children in such a brutal and senseless manner, he has remained focused on keeping their memory alive and supporting causes that could prevent similar tragedies in the future. His run in the Boston Marathon in 2024 became a symbol of resilience, a way to honor his children's legacy while raising awareness for child health and mental health issues. Patrick's journey, though painful, became one of healing through action, using his grief to propel him towards something positive. The case, however, remained unresolved in many respects. The question of whether Lindsay's mental health condition and the overprescription of medications contributed to her actions or whether she had premeditated the murders remained the subject of intense debate. Even as Lindsay's trial proceeded, the public continued to grapple with the complexities of her case. For some, the focus was on the legal questions, whether she could be held criminally accountable despite the presence of postpartum psychosis and the influence of medications. For others, it was about understanding the mental health system and its potential failures in preventing such tragedies. While Lindsay's defense leaned heavily on the argument that her actions were driven by a mental illness, there were others who questioned whether her behavior could be solely attributed to psychiatric factors. Her earlier diary entries, revealing her resentment towards her children and her search for information on sociopathy in ways to kill, suggested that there may have been deeper, more troubling thoughts at play even before her postpartum psychosis had fully manifested. Some experts pointed to the fact that Lindsay had exhibited warning signs of emotional distress, anxiety, and a lack of maternal attachment to her children, that were not adequately addressed in her treatment. The prosecution, in turn, argued that Lindsay's behavior was indicative of a clear and premeditated decision to murder her children. The methodical way in which she carried out the killings, the lack of any immediate signs of mental impairment at the time of the crime, and the fact that she had actively sought out ways to harm her children pointed to a woman who had made a conscious choice to end their lives. They contended that Lindsay had planned the killings over time, and the presence of the medications in her system should not absolve her of her responsibility. The legal battle between the defense and the prosecution centered around the question of whether Lindsay's mental state at the time of the killings should mitigate her criminal liability or whether she should be held fully accountable for her actions. For those who knew Lindsay before the killings, the contrast between the woman they had known and the horrific actions she had taken was both baffling and heartbreaking. Friends and family described Lindsay as someone who had been loving and devoted to her children, but they also spoke of the mounting pressure she had felt in the months leading up to the tragedy. The challenges of motherhood, combined with the intense emotional and physical toll of postpartum depression, had left her feeling overwhelmed and isolated. In hindsight, many of those close to her expressed regret that they had not recognized the severity of her mental health struggles sooner. In the years that followed, the case of Lindsay Clancy would continue to prompt discussions on the intersection of mental health, medication, and violence. Advocates for better maternal mental health care, as well as those involved in the field of psychiatry, would use the case as a catalyst for pushing for systemic changes in the way postpartum depression and psychosis are treated. The tragic events would serve as a reminder of the importance of early intervention, better monitoring of new mothers on psychiatric medications, and a more robust understanding of the risks posed by untreated mental health conditions. As Lindsay remained in treatment, her own personal journey became one of reflection and remorse. While she had yet to speak publicly about the killings, her attorneys noted that she had expressed deep sorrow and regret over what she had done. Whether her feelings were a result of true remorse or a reflection of the disorientation brought on by her mental illness was difficult to say. Regardless, the years of trial proceedings, the media scrutiny, and the pain experienced by her surviving family members seemed to offer little solace in the wake of the loss that had forever altered their lives. Patrick, on the other hand, found solace in the love and support of his extended family and community. The foundation he had created in his children's memory helped fund a variety of initiatives aimed at both supporting families affected by childhood illness and advocating for mental health care reform. Despite his heartbreak, he was determined to help prevent other families from experiencing the unimaginable loss that he had suffered. The journey ahead was uncertain, but Patrick was steadfast in his commitment to make something meaningful out of his children's memory. If you were shocked by this unimaginable turn of events, make sure to hit that subscribe button to stay updated on more chilling true crime stories like this. Like this video if you want to hear more about cases that defy belief, and drop a comment below with your thoughts. What do you think drove her to do the unthinkable? We'd love to hear your take on this tragic story. In the aftermath of the trial, the lingering questions would continue to haunt everyone involved. Could Lindsay have been saved if her mental health issues had been better addressed? Could the tragedy have been avoided with earlier intervention or more appropriate medical care? These questions, though unresolved, would continue to prompt ongoing conversations about the complexities of mental health care, the stigma surrounding postpartum depression and psychosis, and the tragic consequences that can arise when these conditions are left untreated. While Lindsay's actions were undeniably horrific, they also highlighted the desperate need for better understanding and treatment of mental health conditions, especially in the context of new motherhood. Her case would go down in history as a heartbreaking reminder of the dangers posed by untreated psychiatric illness and the devastating toll it could take on families, while also underscoring the importance of a more compassionate and proactive approach to mental health care.